welcome to episode 174 of The Route. The Route is a glorified coffee chat and podcast form that takes you from A to B with a new guest every episode. I'm your host, Christopher Nascimento, and let's get started. Before we begin, just a couple things to cover as per usual. First, if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast, follow the podcast. That's on Apple, Google, Spotify, Amazon, and I believe 6 other audio platforms as well. And in addition to that too, we're on YouTube. So if you want to watch us, that's kind of the main platform now. You can find us just by simply typing the Route Podcast or our username, which is the Route Cast. So the Route and then CAST, and that's our username on all handles. So YouTube, all the classic social media platforms, and the one that's maybe a little more unique to this podcast or a little more niche is LinkedIn. That's kind of the best platform we have just in regards to if you want to connect with myself, the guests, or like-minded people when we share posts and what that episode is that week. It's a great place to start your network, grow your network, and kind of just advance it from there. But yeah, take the time to do so at the Routecast. Follow us on all platforms. But with that said, we can get into today's guest. I'd now like to welcome someone who has began as a professional golfer, then dove headfirst into the commercial space, leading sales teams, becoming a serial investor, and now being the CEO at SPIQE. Adam Holt, welcome to the Route. How's it going?
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and looking forward to dive in today. Listened to a number of the other episodes, and it's great to be on here and tell my story and hopefully make some good connections along the way with some people as well.
No, absolutely. I'm excited to get into it. And as the name states, the Route, if you don't mind, maybe you can kind of tell us where it began and how we got to where we are today, and we'll fill in the gaps from there.
Yeah, for sure. I guess where I am today is definitely not where I expected to be as a 16, 17, 18-year old. As you mentioned, I played professional golf. On my journey, on my route to that, I did 4 years at university in America on a golf scholarship, which was fantastic and eye-opening. And like I said, graduated with a degree in business, never expecting to ever have to use it because I thought I'd be a multimillionaire on the PGA Tour, traveling the world on a private jet. But that didn't quite work out, and for the right reasons now, it's definitely set me up to be where I am today and in the business world. I originally, after trying to play full time, decided to stay in professional sport and pivoted to a sports science kind of kinesiology type role, thinking I was going to be on the support side of things, and that was great until I realised that the paychecks were not that great. So that's when I was like, okay, Stark, my wife, well, my now wife at the time, my girlfriend was at law school on the way to becoming a lawyer, and I was like, I better up my game here a little bit, and that's where the opportunity to go into the city, as they call it, into the business space, kind of pronounced itself to me. And I had the opportunity to go work for initially a publicly traded company, which was an entry level business development role. And I had no right getting an interview, but somehow did, and sat there in front of two VP of sales who both didn't ask me a single question about business, but asked me about the golf swings. And that's where I realized, okay, golf actually helped me here get to where I want to be. And that was, yeah, not too long ago. It was October 2015. So literally 9 years ago, virtually to the day that was. And here we are today. Like I said, that then put me on the pathway to exposure to different sort of technology companies, and whether self-fulfilling prophecy or that I wanted it to happen, I always gravitated towards sports clients, whether it was teams, leagues, brands associated to sports, agencies representing players. So any of the technology that I was selling, whether it was digital analytics, social analytics, I always gravitated to sport. And that's where I kind of went on a pathway then of being headhunted to go to a series of different startups. Increasingly, each one of them became more and more pronounced in the sports tech space. So a logo detection company doing media valuation for some of the biggest teams, leagues, and brands in the world. So McLaren, Formula One, Rolex, etc. And then finally on to a senior role at a sponsorship attribution company, and then ultimately, finally, where I am today as the CEO of SPIQE, which is a combination of basically all the previous companies I've been kind of brought together and all my learning is brought together to build what we're building now, SPIQE, and part of a larger group of companies called Ascend, where we're working with the Champions League, which is again probably the biggest sporting event, single sporting event in the year. Obviously, big clubs like the Real Madrids of the world, the Paris Saint-Germains of the world, and big brands as well. So yeah, it's been a whirlwind. Like I said, I mean, I really kind of jumped out of the sports space 9 years ago to where I am today. And yeah, I've been lucky along the way, met some really good mentors along the way that's helped accelerate my personal growth and learnings in the sports space. Um, so yeah, that's where I am today, and that's been the journey so far, and the route to where I am. And it's had its challenges, but it's also been one hell of a ride, and I wouldn't change anything at this point.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And man, every time I do this, I know it's been 170 something episodes now, but as soon as people share the route, I always have so many questions, and I just want to go back to the beginning. I remember I had a guest as well. They're in the golf world, and I think they were from Ireland, and they went to go do a U.S. scholarship as well
Yeah,
initially, and then they end up staying in, I think it was Texas. And I was kind of curious, just from your experience, how did that work? Because I'm in Canada, and I lived in the U.S. for 1 year, and I know just the university is so much different how people think about it, how they go about scholarships. How did that change for you, right? Because obviously, if you're not in the U.S., it's not something that's on mind at the age of 6, right? So
yeah.
how did that look like, and how did you decide to go to the U.S.? How did you decide on your school? Did you do any visits? Do you mind maybe sharing a bit more about that experience first?
Yeah, for sure. I think for me, it was kind of just, and again, I'm going to date myself here. It's kind of pre Facebook and before social media was kind of buzz. So there was not really a whole lot of access beyond the website to look at these schools back then. But again, just watching golf on television and some of the folks who came before me. I mean, people are golfers. You've got like Luke Donald, Paul Casey, who have been like world number one, top 10, multiple Ryder Cups and stuff. Like those are the sort of guys who initially made it cool for Europeans to go to the US to school, and they were kind of 10 years ahead of me. So, kind of hearing them, that's what they've done, that's where they've been, and always having your parents or people around you saying, well, always have a backup plan. So, to me, it kind of sounded like a good option and an opportunity to leave home and go explore something new. So, that's when it came on my radar as like a 16, 17-year old. And that's when I started taking it seriously. I had to do, in the US, you have to do your SATs to be able to get into college. So I had to sit them in the UK. So I had to study for all them. So it was a lot of work to get there. But luckily for me at the time, they'd started to do like spotlight tournaments or kind of like recruiting tournaments in the UK to where coaches could access the scores or they'd come over, they'd meet with students and potential student athletes. So that's where that kind of put me on a little bit of the radar, a bit of the map with college coaches to be able to get some initial offers. And then once I started to get a little bit of traction and understood what the process looked like, I started to reach out myself then to people. And luckily, with golf being an individual sport, it's not like soccer or basketball or something where you can kind of hide behind the team. The scores and the performance ultimately speaks for itself. So if a coach could see, okay, this player or this individual shoots X, Y, and Z in this tournament against this field, they know pretty good like where you are from a caliber perspective. So I did reach out to a few schools, and ultimately I kind of had a couple of options. I had an option to go to the West Coast to San Diego or down in Florida, and I ultimately chose Florida just based on proximity to home because I was like 17 years old making a decision. I'm like, okay, that's a 13-hour flight, a 9-hour time difference. It's quite a long way. So I ultimately chose Florida. And yes, I was trying to pick places with good weather. I didn't want to go to Northeast, even though I live here now in the Northeast. And that was it ultimately. So it was a combination of I played well at the right time, got on the radar of some coaches, and then used that as leverage to be able to talk to other coaches. And ultimately, you have to start selling yourself even back then because there's thousands of kids, hundreds of kids trying to get into universities. And even at that stage, you got to start marketing yourself. And that's something I realized now that I was doing that at getting into college, and I was doing that as a professional, trying to raise sponsorship money. So again, now I've kind of where I am now. A lot of those fundamental lessons I learned them trying to play golf ultimately.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. And I guess there's a few points you mentioned that I want to touch back on. The first one is just being that backup plan. That made me chuckle because I feel like
I
the
didn't
amount of
see it
times
like
you
that,
hear
man. I
people.
just did that. I just did that to stop people being asking me the question, "Oh, what happens if it doesn't work?" I just kind of did it just to shut people up ultimately. But
Yeah.
yeah, it is what it is.
Yeah, and I find that that kind of builds well too in regards to what you were saying earlier, where I think you're saying you're getting a business degree, but you're all in on golf, so you never really thought you were going to go back and use it. I'm always kind of curious when people talk about what they, let's say someone that went to school and they say what they studied. Sometimes too, it is what they studied and that's what they end up having a career in. But sometimes it looks like there's always like a fork in the road, and that's probably where with your golf career, where that's when you dove into business a bit further. But when you first picked that degree, did you have any inkling of why you should pick business over psychology? Was there anything, or you're like, oh, let me just do this and see how it goes?
See, that's just what student athletes did. It was kind of
Yeah.
it was I hate saying the lightest workload, but it was like again versus the university I went to initially, they had like people who were going from the science department into NASA because it was kind of close to NASA. So like that was the sort of like other courses you could do, and like I was no way going to try and become a scientist, and that so I was like, what's the lightest workload? What's the lightest one to potentially pass? And that's ultimately why I chose the business one. And it sounded cool, but again, similar to your fork in the road situation, I actually then, once I stopped playing professional golf and I pivoted into the sports science space, I actually ended up getting a master's degree in sports science kinesiology. So that's where my appreciation for numbers, data, and analytics came about, which then the combination of that plus the business aspect is kind of what's put me where I am now. So even I had to do that pivot and become a bit more knowledgeable and kind of like I said, the statistics, the data analytics side of things that allowed me to kind of get to where I am today. So even I had that change and 360 spins. I've done it multiple times now. Started in business, went to sports science, then went back to business. So yeah, there you go.
I don't know. That's good stuff for sure. And then I guess just building on that, you kind of referred to it, and it kind of initially lit up a light bulb in my head because this podcast initially is more sports business focused for the first 120, 140 episodes. Everyone was kind of in the sports business space. Now, kind of a little bit more broad words, people in business. Well, they're obviously I always kind of lean towards the sports side because that's what I enjoy as well. But when I have those people on, a lot of times when I speak to them afterwards, they would just share about how people would get to that fork in the road themselves where maybe it's that time where they're about to get into their late 20s, maybe it's their 30s where they're trying to settle down. They have maybe an upcoming wife or they're need to buy a house, etc. And like you're saying, the sports base doesn't always pay the most. When did you maybe hit that wall and realize, hey, I got to start looking elsewhere, dive into the business development world a bit further? I know you said it still dabbled in sports, but was there anything further that made you hit that wall? Was there an experience?
Yeah, I think this is. I mean, again, it's not that long ago. It's 10 years ago, literally. So the 2014 through to early 2015, I was like the head of performance for a professional rugby team for the academy. Um, and that's where I worked like 11 months of the year straight from 7 a.m. till 8 p.m., 7 days a week. And you realize that this is not, like, again, you sit there at the end of the year and you do the maths and that you're making way, way, way below minimum wage based on the hours and the time and everything you put into it. And then I'm sitting there looking at my wife who's articling, well, my now wife who's interning and doing articling at law firms where they're billing £800, £1,000 an hour for their work, and I'm just like, oh, like there's a bit of a gap there. So that was kind of the moment to me. It's just like I want to have nice things. It's like I'm working all these hours. It's cool. I get tickets to go and watch games and whatnot. But it's like again, it wasn't giving me the satisfaction away from the job that I ultimately wanted to get to. And I started looking like, okay, like we get married, we have kids, like I can't buy like the ring that I would or doesn't want to get you. I couldn't do this. So at the time, it was a monetary thing, I think, for me that kind of was the motivation. But that's now shifted to where I genuinely enjoy what I do, and the money's just kind of a side piece of it now. So, yeah, that was kind of my aha moment, my wake up moment, where it's like, okay, something's got to change at this point.
Yeah, I can personally definitely relate to that. Where at the start of the career, I was all in on sport. I was in accounting when I started at school, and when you hit that wall, working the cubicle, working on Excel sheets, I was like, oh, I can't do this. So I went the whole other direction. I was like, I'm just gonna go straight into sports marketing. It's gonna be a dream working in sports. And I was working for a soccer team, doing all these crazy hours, like you're saying. And then when you actually, and I think a bunch of people have said this on this podcast, they said never to average out what you're making an hour for the amount of hours you're doing in sports because you're going to get depressed. Looking at that, and when you start considering that and then doing it different years in sports too, I kind of hit that wall as well where I was about to, I wanted to start looking for a ring, get a house, etc. And that sports almost made me a bit more jaded because there wasn't that alignment there where it was either have the lifestyle you want or work in this, let's say, unfair environment to an extent where you're going to put crazy hours and not get paid for it. So I kind of had something similar and went into business development from there. And then
Yeah.
once you got that, do you think that developed a bit more of a spark in you, let's say? Because I know when I did that transition, I felt like I had something to prove or had some ground to make up.
Yeah, I would say. I mean, I would say I've had somewhat of a chip on my shoulder in terms of like I don't think it's more of a. I don't really think there's. It's hard way to describe it. Almost that don't know whether I should be here kind of feeling because it's like you've got no real basis or grounding to be there. But then it's also the athlete mode kicks in then where it's like, well, I'm going to be a sponge and I'm going to learn this. I am going to kick your ass along the way. So yeah, I mean, there's obviously that moment of like, what am I doing here? Like rabbit in the headlights. But then the innate kind of the innate kind of like let's just go fight and let's grind this out and let's figure out how we make this work. That kicked in for me then, and then slowly kind of started to be successful. You close your first deal, you do this, and all of a sudden the snowball effect kicks in. And then, I mean, ultimately, like when you start closing big deals or big partnerships, like you get a similar kind of rush or kick as when you would win a tournament or play a good round and stuff. So the end kind of like feelings inside end up being very similar. You got the same sort of rush, just in a slightly different way and obviously different feel.
And for that, then, how did that then lead into your career? Because I think you started mentioning how you were headhunted to join some different companies,
Yeah,
and that's how that kind of progressed from there. Was the
yeah.
first one like that as well, or was that your network? Was that
The
you
first one was
applying?
my network. First one was
Yeah.
purely just again, friends of a family member who was like the SVP of the region was like, well, I can't give you a job, but I can get you an interview, and then it's up to you what you do then. So he ended up getting me an interview, didn't tell anybody that he knew me, just said, like, talk to this guy, seems to have good characteristics. And like I said, that was the interview where the two VP of sales were asking me about the golf swing for half an hour each versus anything business related. So I got in the door there, and then that company was the reseller for a tech startup based out of New York. And I was the young kid on the block, and that tech startup was a social media analytics and research company. This was back in 2015 when that was all kind of the hot topic. Facebook and Instagram weren't the same business back then, so it was kind of like that was the golden era for that almost. And I kind of gravitated towards that and really got dove head first, and then ultimately started selling more of that product than any of the actual sellers were. And I was part of the reselling team in the UK. And then the CEO of that company just said, "Why don't you come and do this direct for me?" So I went from literally no job in business to being said, "Okay, come and run this. Be our only person outside of North America in the space of 18 months." And I was naive and kind of just like, sure, why not? Let's do this. Fake it till I make it. And luckily, it turned out to be a good move. And that CEO, she's been a mentor now since then, and we're good friends and stuff. So it's been a good ride, that's for certain. But yeah, it was a bit of the right place at the right time, and then just me being, again, I never had an issue from an ego perspective, just asking so many questions. The dumb, even if it was dumb, I would just ask questions, I would learn, I'd be a sponge, I'd just absorb. I say that now to people, they come to me for advice or kind of guidance on how to get started or where to go. It's again, it's just purely ask questions and be an absolute sponge, absorb every single piece of information you can do, and that's ultimately kind of what got me that initial start, and then snowball effect from there, compounds and snowballs to ultimately you get to where you want to get to.
Yeah, and then I might have missed or cut here for a bit, but how did that second role come about with that CEO that's now a mentor? Was that something that you're saying?
So
I
yeah,
might have
that's
missed that. Yeah.
yeah. So the very first company I was at, so I was based in London, England at the time.
Hmm.
They were the resellers for this other tech startup in the European markets. So the CEO of my second company used to work for my first company, and then she left, set up this company, but still had relationships. So she used the sales team internationally because the my very first job was with a company that's Nasdaq traded, thousands of employees globally versus a tiny little startup that's got 15 people. So she was leveraging the sales engine of the big company. And like I said, I just kind of gravitated towards what they were selling, what they were doing. Like I said, it was social media. It was kind of the on trend, on point thing. I was the young person in the room and it kind of just fitted well. And yeah, I sold a lot of it. And that was where I got offered to go work directly. And I jumped at it.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I remember you saying that, but I appreciate you going back and clarifying some items. And I guess with that as well, you're kind of saying how you kind of said you faked it till you made it, and then right place, right time, things worked out and went from there. And then how did that snowball effect then impact some of the other things you started doing, right? You mentioned you started working for a lot of other companies that were, then acquired or publicly traded. And then, like I mentioned as well, you started investing in some other ones. How do those future opportunities start coming about, and what did that then look like for you?
Yeah, I think it just came from the network that continued to evolve and grow around me. So when I went to work for the startup, they went through a phase where they were raising outside capital. So I was talking to the investors and the potential investors around international growth and international expansion and what I was thinking, what I was doing. So that was my first experience of venture capital and private equity. So that's something that I learned within my first 2 and a bit years in the business space. I managed to have that exposure and that kind of understanding of learning and bring that information inside to my knowledge, and that network grew. And similarly, then starting to network with people who have been senior people at other tech startup and they've gone and done other things, and that's where ultimately I am where I am today. Yes, it's been hard work and a bit of luck, but like it's a lot of it's just it's networking and it's meeting people and talking to people. And I've never, other than that very first job that I got in the business space, I've never applied for another job. It's been someone called me, it wasn't even a recruiter, someone senior at another company has called me and said, would you be interested in this? And that's then where the discussions begin. So again, that's been a fun thing, not having to really apply for stuff and things come to me and you can make good decisions then.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then I guess you're kind of saying just meet people and talk to them. But let's say someone starts tuning in because we have a wide variety of listeners where it's from that student age to, the classic professionals going into the 50s. What
Yeah.
would you say if someone's maybe on the bit younger side listening in and they're saying, "Hey, I don't have, let's say, that network initially, or I'm not in a company right now where I could potentially get that initial exposure to investors." How would you maybe
Yeah. I think if you
provide
go
insight?
like,
Yeah.
yeah, I think if you go back to like the universities or the higher education places that you kind of come from, they obviously have alumni that you can normally go through and search of where they've gone. And generally speaking, yeah, people are kind of good at talking to people from those kind of scenarios. You've got something in common, you can mutually agree on stuff and talk to stuff mutually. So that's that piece. Um, Again, people like yourself who are putting these podcasts out there. I mean, if people reach out to me after this, I can guarantee you're going to get a response from me. I don't not respond to anything. So there's another avenue, another opportunity for people to talk, engage, and even just engage in conversation publicly as well. So like you mentioned on LinkedIn, like start having a conversation in the chats, in the feeds, because that way then other people can see it, other people get involved, and before you know it, it's gone from a one-on-one conversation to six, seven, eight, nine people being involved on like-minded topics. And there's six or seven people who are likely to respond to you and get on the phone and talk to you and help mentor you. So that's ultimately kind of where you can start to get in. You've ultimately got to put yourself out there as well. And you're going to get told no a lot of times, but you got to keep putting yourself out there. And ultimately, you will find somebody who opens up a door and says, sure, I'll talk to you. I'll kind of give you my thoughts and ideas.
No, that's great. Appreciate you providing more insight on that. And then touching on what you were just saying before that, how that initial role you applied to went through that interview process, and then from there is really your network where these opportunities were coming to you. I have a question in regards to how you then knew when the opportunity was right for you, and also when was it the right time to then change to the next challenge.
Yeah, it's a good question. I get asked this a lot now by people, people in my friends network who are kind of going through similar things, and I always kind of had the 2-quarter rule. Kind of was my from a sales perspective. If I saw things slowing down for multiple 2 quarters in a row, then that for me started to become a red flag of. And again, if it's my fault, I have to own it. But if it's not my fault, and I think it's products aren't developing correctly or quick enough, or markets aren't developing or slowing down, that was always kind of my indication of, okay, something under the surface here is fundamentally not working. That let's start to evaluate where we're at, and then that then would be the time that I'd be open to conversations. And then some of them are just purely opportunistic, or they come about via an introduction. So the third role I ever got, which was commercial lead for a logo detection company, that came from. I got reached out to by a client who said, we've got another vendor that would be interested in someone like you. Would you be interested? And I'm like, sure, why not? You could always take a call and chat and explore. And then that snowballed into something. It didn't happen overnight. It took several months before we were all in a position to say, yeah, let's do it. But ultimately, that's kind of where that came around. So it's very individual. It's very based on where the individual's at. Again, some people are at a job for 10 years, some people are at a job for 2 years. And again, for me, it was always just a case of how do I get to the next level and to the next step in my career, and am I able to do that in the place I am? If I am, great, we can stay and explore. If not, where do I need to go to do that? And I always seeked out good bosses as well. So again, I always wanted to go work for somebody who I ultimately could learn a lot from. And then I was very blunt to people and call it arrogant or cocky, but I used to always joke with my bosses, like, I'm coming to get your job. And that's kind of the mindset I wanted. And I wanted to be a sponge and learn from them to put myself in a position where I could ultimately get their job or go somewhere else and do that job as well. So that's where I used to always be selective on who I was going to work for as well, or work with, because that ultimately decides or dictates a lot of what you can do from a success perspective.
And on that note too, let's say you're in the process of evaluating a new opportunity. How would you go about maybe evaluating if this is a boss you'd want to work for? Because obviously it's a different environment. You're not with them on the day to day where you see how they are acting in different scenarios. So what kind of things were you doing to maybe evaluate that?
Asking clients, asking people they've worked with, people they've been to in the past, just like they take references on you as the employee, I was taking references on them as the employer as well. So again, how do they treat clients, both their high end clients and their low end clients as well? Because if they're treating the tier 1 clients great, but the tier 2 clients like garbage, then is that the place you want to go to? So I would always do that sort of research myself, like self-directed research, to really understand if that's somewhere that I wanted to go from like a cultural perspective, um, before diving into somewhere.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Then I guess before we get into Spike, for personal or even let's say selfish reasons, I'm so curious about all the different companies you own, invest in, advise. I know you mentioned how they maybe first came about when you got exposure to investments, but then how do you evaluate, hey, what I want to get into? How do you go about having so many, let's say, different hats you need to put on to advise, invest, and then also be a CEO.
Yeah, I mean, like again, like a lot of the investment stuff, it can be quite passive. So it's more of a, is this a product that myself or my family want to use, or a service? And if it is, I look at investment, and I've been fortunate enough along the way that I've had early stage startups where individuals who are decently successful business people have given money and put money in, try and help you get somewhere. So I'm trying to pay it back a little bit, I guess, in that way. But yeah, ultimately it comes down to something that, like I said, my family or I want to use, or we do use, or we leverage on a regular basis. So I'm invested in, for Canadian listeners, a company called Nana Shake or Nana Pop. They go by both names, which is a alternative dairy-free ice cream, which ultimately I met the husband and wife who started that at my local grocery store when I was with my kids buying groceries one day. They were doing a demo. We tried it. The kids loved it. I started buying it every week, and I eventually just reached out to the CEO and was like, "Are you guys raising capital?" And it turned out they wanted to, and I was part of that process for them. So it could be opportunistic things like that, or it can be stuff that synergistically sits where I want to sit. So I invested in a golf performance business. Obviously, being from my golf background, it makes sense. I've got a ton of injuries, makes sense. So that's where just again synergies just align to me as an individual, or me and my family, and what makes sense to us ultimately is kind of the route I try and go down. And I look at everything at this point. I mean, I've spent so much time now on running my own businesses that I can look at balance sheets, projections, markets, and make decisions relatively quickly based on numbers. And ultimately, it's a gamble, it's a risk, but if it's one I think is worth taking, I take it.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, and it's kind of cool too to hear, like, even just in regards to the Nana Shake, where you know, I think maybe sometimes you think about how an investment could come about. You have all these different theories or stories about how it could start, but simply just meeting them in the grocery store, it's a good product you enjoy using, and kind of going from there. So that's pretty cool. And then
Yeah,
I guess now diving a bit more into SPIQE, I'd like to maybe dive into it a bit further. Maybe if someone's, let's say, joining the podcast now, and they're like, "What is SPIQE?"
yeah.
How would you bring that up? And maybe from there we can dive into it a bit further.
No, for sure. I think ultimately the way I describe SPIKE is we're trying to be the market leader for sports marketing, analytics, insights, and data. So traditional marketing, or marketing on like Facebook, people know that, okay, you're exposed to something, you then go and transact, you click or whatever it may be. Whereas sports marketing is such a soft area for marketing, and by that I mean you can go to a stadium and see a Pepsi advert in the stadium, but no one knows, or the Pepsi don't really know, like, what's that doing for them. So that's where at SPIKE we're setting out, and by using the background and the experience I've had and team I have around me has had, to build solutions to be able to answer those questions for people. Because ultimately you look at Pepsi, Coca-Cola, AB InBev, like they spend tens, if not hundreds of millions every year sponsoring big events, sports teams, leagues, etc. And they ultimately want to know, like, do they get an ROI from that? And they struggled in the past to do so. And that's where SPIKE has come around now to start to answer those questions. And we're way further ahead than anyone else who's been out there in the past has done. So like I said, it's a culmination of years of experience across different areas of sports business and sports tech that's allowing us to build SPIKE today as kind of the premier go-to sports marketing, insights, data and analytics hub slash company for these big brands and teams and leagues.
Yeah, that's a great point because even just what you're saying there in regards to what Spike's about, I remember when I first decided I wanted to get sports into sports marketing when I started my career. I remember I was having all these different conversations and just being a curious person, the different questions I had. I remember I was meeting with people and I said, "Hey, off the top of my head, let's say you have Stadium X, right? And there's a naming reg still up. I'm like, how do you evaluate that? Because I'm like, obviously there's people walking by, people entering the stadium, all so many different types of assets that can be involved in that. And no one really had a concrete answer in regards to how something like the naming rights, which could be such a significant deal kind of came about. So that's kind of cool to hear where you're adding that data, maybe going back to your sports science thing, where you're saying you're including more data and something that's kind of evolved in your career as well to make those decisions.
Yeah, now ultimately, like you said, it's a question that still goes unanswered a lot in the sports marketing space, but as the as the advertising and the marketing ecosystem as a whole continues to converge inwards on itself a little bit in the sense of it's all becoming much more connected. That's where the sports marketing teams and individuals have to be much smarter and coming to the table with good data to back up decisions of why they're doing certain things. I mean, historically, you've heard, I mean, I'm sure you've heard hundreds of stories that a CMO will sponsor a baseball team because he's a fan of that team, and with the sponsorship, he gets tickets for the year. So that sort of deal, those sort of deals are definitely going away as they're becoming much more business deals now to actually say, okay, we're going to spend the money, but this is the business reason why. And ultimately, they need to prove that business reason and prove that they're hitting those KPIs. And that's where SPIQE is coming to the forefront now to really help drive the industry forward ultimately from where it's been for decades at this point now.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I guess before we kind of get into what your role entails and what kind of things you're working on, how did that opportunity first come about? I think that's something we were touching on throughout the podcast, but how did Spike come along for you and how did you get involved?
Yeah, like I said, I've been a part of a number of sport tech businesses like over the last several years. And I guess I was doing the last 2 years I was part of, I actually went back ironically to the original company I worked for because they acquired the startup I left them to go and do. It's a long story, but I ended up going back and working an earn out. Um, yeah, I think February this year, I was in Toronto at the NHL All Star game, literally going to have lunch with a friend. That was it. I had no other intentions. But whilst I'm having lunch at the hotel near the arena, I ended up running into 12 different people who were in the sports ecosystem, and they were like, "Oh, Adam, what you doing?" Da da da. And at that point, then I just thought I need to get back into this space because it was just connections were there and like the doors were opening. And again, and to me, that was, you asked before, like, what's the triggers to go and do something? That was the trigger for me. It was like, okay, I'm missing out on something here. So that started the pathway of what should I go and do, or how should I go about doing it. And I had an idea of what I wanted to do, and I ended up speaking to several different companies about going to work for them as like chief strategy or chief operating officer and building like this sort of a business within those businesses. I spoke to individual investors, and then I ultimately, the folks I'm with now, which is a sports tech holding group based out of Switzerland, who own several other sport tech businesses, everything from they manufacture the LED boards that go into stadiums. They have a business that runs the relationships with teams, leagues, federations. They have technology that can dynamically change the digital overlay that goes on to TV broadcast. So you can be watching a football game that's taking place live in Spain, but you're going to see different adverts in Canada than you'd see in the US, than you'd see in other countries. So we own that technology. They have a programmatic platform by which you can buy the sports tech or the sports inventory. And then they ultimately wanted to build a data and insights business. And I was like, you guys have a lot of the other pieces that can make my life easier. Let's do this together. So that's ultimately where SPIQE came about. Is we, again, from February until we launched a couple of months ago, it was kind of ideating, talking about what a deal or structure would look like, and getting us to where we are today, where ultimately, yeah, the CEO of SPIQE, and I actually I just bought one of my old sport tech companies as part of this new venture, so we're rolling in that technology. We just released the press release for that last week, so again, the momentum just continues to snowball and positive kind of movements taking place, and we've been operational a couple of months. We've got several clients already. We're approaching break even. So from a business and a business metrics perspective, like we're doing really good. So it's been a whirlwind, that's for certain.
Yeah, it's crazy how things kind of come about, and it's so cool to hear what kind of goes into Spike and how that all came to be and what you guys are attached to as well. And I guess with that, maybe one of the last questions I have before we wrap it up, what does that then entail for your role, right? Being the CEO of Spike, obviously I know each day is, I'm sure, different, but what does that kind of entail? Like, what kind of things are you doing to grow the company? Obviously, you're getting to that break even point, but then from there, like, what things are you then looking at to keep the business going?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, I'm wearing every hat that possibly exists right now. If we had a physical office, I'd be the general as well, I think, at this point. That everything, business development, partnerships, product development, productization. Luckily, I've got a small but a very experienced team around me. So folks I've worked with at previous companies who've got experience that we've come in and we see the world very similar from in terms of where we think the industry is and where we think it needs to go to. And ultimately, with being attached to a wider portfolio of companies as well, I'm building products for those other businesses as well. So one of our companies, which is the programmatic sponsorship buying platform, they needed a metric to truly value the assets that they have. So traditional TV buys are a certain CPM, but sport inherently has huge illegal streaming piracy, has a huge social reach, has a huge value of IP that being associated to some of these large teams that no one figured out. So within our first few weeks of business, we've built a methodology that can start to answer that. So it's kind of coming out beta mode now, taking it to clients, and the industry is loving it. They're buying into it. So literally, my role is every single day is how do we make money today? How do we make money tomorrow? And ultimately, how do we continue to grow the business going forwards? And I'm literally sitting across all of that right now with a fantastic team around me that gets us to where we are today, and hopefully we can continue to push forward and ultimately keep trying to shift kind of the status quo of the industry to where we think it needs to go to.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I appreciate you sharing that, and quite the day to day is what you can say there. And I guess
Yeah,
to kind of wrap up the podcast, how I typically like doing it is obviously went through your whole route to date so far, and it's been great. And what I always like to think, I hope at least, I'm going to live until I'm 103. So I like to ask each guest, if you're 103, you're on a rocking chair, thinking about all the good times that you've had in your career so far, what's one story that when you're sitting down, you're 103, you're thinking back about everything, what's one thing that's going to stick out and you're surely going to remember at 103 and be like, wow, I can't believe I did that for work at one point in time?
I don't know if it's. I think for me, the thing that would ultimately stick out is that what you think is your dream today isn't necessarily the dream 5 or 10 years time, and you've got to be open to change and open to being able to shift where you think your sense of going in the right direction is. Like I said, I mean, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, you told me what I'm doing now, I just laughed at you and said, no chance. But ultimately, it's kind of like where you end up getting to. So I think it's ultimately like not so much a story of like where you've gone, but also kind of the story of like where how you've pivoted, how you've changed. And I think if you've ever read Steve Jobs' books or listened to him talk, he always mentions like you can only connect the dots going backwards, you can't connect them going forwards. And that's again something that resonates with me and something that I always kind of keep why I always try and keep an open mind to stuff because ultimately you don't know if you turn left or you turn right where it's going to go, but that's where you've got to be open to it and make the right decision for you or your family ultimately along the way. Because you got to look after number one before you can look after everybody else.
No, absolutely. I think that's perfectly put. And you're kind of touching on perfectly the last question I'm like asking as well is going back in time, right? Going from 103-year-old Adam to let's say 16, 17, 18, 19-year-old version of yourself. If you go back in time and speak to that younger self, what's one piece of advice that you've now learned that if you could share with your younger self, what would that be?
Ultimately, patience. I was like, that age, I was so impatient to stuff and wanted it yesterday, but that's just not how life works ultimately. And get enough, enjoy the time you have as well. Because once I've got two young kids, so my wife and I joke, we sit there, it's like, what did we do with our time before kids? It's like you have so much time to yourself that take advantage of it and fill it up with experiences and learnings and taking as much as you can do. I said no to too much stuff probably as a 17, 18-year-old. It was too serious on got to be golf, got to be this, got to be that, versus taking life experiences that make you a bit more of a rounded person ultimately.
Yeah, that's perfect, and that's exactly why I like ending the podcast with that. I find it ends it well. It kind of wraps it all, that whole experience. And unless there's anything else you'd like to share, thank you for coming on, and
Nah,
it was a pleasure for me even just being able to chat with you about it.
yeah, likewise. Thank you for having me, Chris. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, and that's it for episode 174, and we'll see everyone next episode.